the guidance that was put out, where they're essentially listing any reason that you may oppose the government makes you essentially a domestic terrorist. So do you think that, we're really moving in a bad direction soon, where free speech is going to be potentially punished by the government?
This whole thing with the domestic terrorism movement, it's astonishing to me that there are people who lived through the first war on terror who don't know where this is headed. They've essentially taken the same campaign that Dick Cheney and people like Donald Rumsfeld launched in 2001, which was a gigantic power ask, right? The argument was, we're under threat. The tools that we have to fight that threat are insufficient, so we need a vast new authority to listen to what everybody is saying, to secretly punish people, to eliminate due process for certain kinds of offenders, because that will just slow us down. And what ended up happening was we spent 20 years building this essentially unaccountable state within a state of vast surveillance state that we can't do anything about. It's essentially beyond the law at this point. And now they've rebranded that. That first campaign was aimed more at Republicans than it was at Democrats. They've rebranded it for sort of blue state audiences, and they're saying, yeah, we need vast new powers to prevent January 6th from happening again, and we want you to cooperate with the authorities in building this gigantic new machinery that will keep everybody safe. But we know how this ends. I mean, it's going to end in a domestic surveillance state that is just inescapable, and it's astonishing to me that people who were raised as liberal thinkers and as people who value civil rights and understand ostensibly what happens in authoritarian governments, that they don't recognize where this is going. I mean, it's just as clear as day, what this kind of behavior is going to lead to. And yet you see people who, 15 years ago would have been shaking their fist at Dick Cheney and Bush, and they're cheering this on because they suddenly think the security services are on their side. It's just nuts to me.
So something that's a little difficult to talk about on the left with any kind of nuance is how the government has reacted to COVID and also the January 6th riot at the Capitol. And I think that a lot of folks on the left really don't feel comfortable questioning either of those things for sounding as though they're a right-wing conspiracy theorist. But I think there can be an extreme to that, where I came across somebody on Twitter where in their bio it said Ashley Babbitt got what she deserved. So I don't know. Can you just maybe speak to maybe some of the potentially dystopian reactions that we might be seeing in regards to both COVID and the January 6th riot?
So there's a trend that we've seen in media and in culture generally, where rather than think through each individual issue or each individual subject, what people have done is they've worked backwards. Like, whatever Donald Trump said, we're on the other side of that. So with COVID, it resulted in all sorts of bizarre situations where Donald Trump says he's taking hydroxychloroquine, so ipso facto, the three dots, therefore, right? Therefore, hydroxychloroquine is a conspiracy theory. Well, in fact, hydroxychloroquine is just a drug. It doesn't have political content. It maybe didn't work, but it was something that had to be investigated on its own merits, irrespective of Donald Trump. I mean, Trump had nothing to do with it, and this has been kind of the instinct that we've seen over and over and over again with this issue. Whatever he said about masks, we were on the other side of that. Whatever people believed about lockdowns or the use of ventilators or shutting down the borders or whatever it was, people just took the opposite side, and that was how they thought things through. And again, it's not a smart way of dealing with things. From a reporter's perspective, you just can't do that. You got to wipe the slate clean with each story and evaluate everything on its own terms. and we haven't done that with the insurrection. I hate even using that word because there's a propaganda reason they use that, but
it was a coup, Matt.
Yeah, it was a coup. I mean, look, there were, as we've seen with the Russia story, there were sort of myriad mistakes in over-reporting of that, from the Brian Sicknick thing, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a tendency to sort of just go along with this narrative that it was it was something more horrible than 9/11, and not to examine, well, who might benefit from believing that, right? Like, again, what's the end game here? And if the end game is we're going to have a domestic terrorism bill where we're going to have FISA now directed at American citizens or something like that, you have to worry about that. You have to think about that. But people don't think about that because it's unacceptable to be even seen questioning these things, because people are afraid of the thing you were talking about at the beginning of the show, where you're accused of being right-wing for bringing up any of these questions. I mean, it's like a vicious cycle, The fear of being cast in with the evil Trumpists has led to this intellectual paralysis about issues that have nothing to do with Trump. And I think that's a dangerous place for not just the left, but for anyone to be.
So, Matt, I know we've gone a full hour. I don't know if you have just a few more minutes for you. I did have some questions from my patrons for you.
Sure.
Aggressive Leftists ask, hey, Matt, I'm a huge fan of your work. I have noticed a lot of security state propaganda like Russiagate or regime change in Libya and Syria is targeted towards the left. With things like this and the recent woke CIA ad, why do you think this type of propaganda is now being directed more towards the left?
Well, I think that's obvious. I think a lot of people who are in the national security world recognize that their most potent opposition has come from the other side. And let's not forget that they were in a little bit of trouble in 2014 and 2015 after Snowden came out with his revelations. There was an enormous amount of coverage of John Brennan and James Clapper lying to Congress. There were calls for their resignations. There was a lot of negative coverage of the drone assassination campaign, and they were on the wrong side of a pretty serious sort of movement that was led almost entirely, on the left. And they've flipped the script. They've managed to make people like Julian Assange into a villain. They have used the Trump years to rehabilitate their image by presenting themselves as sort of allies of the resistance, and they've cured a lot of their public relations problems. And this shouldn't be surprising because these people are public relations experts. That's what they do. They lie for a living, and they're good at it. I mean, so we shouldn't be surprised that they've turned around and tried to ingratiate themselves with their harshest critics, because that's the obvious move. It's taken a while for them to get there, but they didn't have to do it before, because the left was never a threat to anybody until recently. So they could safely ignore them once upon a time. Now they can't. So they're going after them.